Welcome, everyone. My name is Stephen Schultz. I am the Director of State Legislative Affairs for the Arthritis Foundation, overseeing our state program. And we're back with you again today for, I think, what will be a very fun session where we will talk about where are they now, a legislative edition session to hear about the full life cycle of a bill from kind of the start, the issue, model language, to grassroots advocacy, lobby days, and the final signature. Like I said, I think this is going to be a fun session, kind of get into some of the wonkiness, but then also kind of really stress the importance of where you as an advocate can really help guide us through, but then also provide some context as far as when you're doing your advocacy, kind of what are some of the behind the scenes terms and things that are crucial to know. And so I'm joined here today with two very crucial members of our National Advocacy Committee, with Deb Constantine and Kevin Brennan. And I'll let them introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about themselves and how they got on a panel like this today. So I'll start with you, Deb.
Sure. I'm Deb Konstein. I am in the Madison, Wisconsin area. My journey started when I was 13 years old. I went in for a surgery and came home a very different person. I had a foot surgery, which basically triggered my rheumatoid arthritis. So 39 years and counting having RA. So yeah, that's kind of where that came. And I didn't know it was going to be like something that I would be interested in, but advocacy just came out of the woodwork as far as starting to volunteer. It wasn't something I was like token interested in until I learned more about it. And my journey through the Arthritis Foundation has made it probably one of my greatest passions, being part of the Arthritis Foundation, and like being part of all these different pieces. And it's been great. Kevin.
Thanks, Deb. Kevin Brennan. I was diagnosed with psoriatic arthritis around the same age that Deb was diagnosed. I say that it ruined an otherwise mediocre football career, and my desire to become an astronaut was sidelined by the diagnosis. But that interest in being an astronaut was what kind of led me every year to go to the Air and Space Museum and eventually to meet Senator John Glenn, who was sort of my childhood hero. And that was sort of what opened the door to me to get interested in politics, which then led me to work for Congressman Sherrod Brown, and then over time, eventually, Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro. As a kid with arthritis, I spent a whole lot of time not talking about it because I didn't find that it was the most effective way to get dates to launch out describing something that I associated with an old person's disease, because I didn't really get a chance to meet anybody who had psoriatic arthritis until I was about 26 years old and was on my journey to becoming to work for the Arthritis Foundation and serving in the advocacy department in Washington. So I've come full circle, and now that I'm a volunteer in the organization that I also used to be a staff person for, and I've had a particular passion around juvenile arthritis and the issues that the foundation has embraced because of my journey, which was at times somewhat lonely, but now I'm surrounded by wonderful people like Stephen and Deb and others, and it's just been wonderful. So I love the opportunity to talk to you guys and share a little bit of our journey, and hope you all will want to join us in that advocacy journey.
Absolutely. Well, let's start out with the thing that is necessary for us to do in the advocacy is an issue. What are the things that's causing us to advocate? And so, Deb, I'm going to start with you as far as kind of, have you ever seen or interacted with other patients that have experienced an issue before it became an advocacy ask, and what that was like before there was kind of anything that you could point to as a solution, and how that was?
Yeah, I first experienced step therapy, first fail, whatever you want to call it, firsthand. And it was actually with a stomach medication that was, my stomach was having all kinds of issues because of all of my RA medications. And the medication that was working for me, there was a formulary change, and my insurance company decided to not cover it anymore. So they kind of threw me in the pile of everybody else. Well, this is a medication that most other people do really well with, so let's put you on that instead. And I had all kinds of issues, and I had a young son at that point, and silly to say, but a stomach medication really took me out of commission. And my husband actually did a lot of fighting on behalf of me because when you're not feeling well, you don't really have that fight in you. So my husband kind of did all the fighting with the insurance company. And again, I had to go probably through 4 other medications before they actually went back to the first medication to begin with and put me back on it. Biosimilars, that was another one as well that I had experience with, as well as the copay accumulators and things like that. So I've had my own experiences, and again, a host of stories from lots and lots of friends that have experienced the horrors of healthcare, where it can actually lead you. So I've had a lot of experiences, personal as well as just conversations with friends.
And Kevin, and you feel free to, you can answer that too, but I'm just curious from your perspective of overseeing the Arthritis Foundation Advocacy Department, kind of what's it take for us to go from kind of having this issue, having a story like Deb's, and having that rise to the level of an organization saying, hey, we need to develop a position statement, or we need to go see if other organizations are dealing with this too. Kind of when was that kind of trigger occur?
Yeah, I mean, I'll go back and maybe tell a little ancient history, but, remembering the days when, my rheumatologist would, hand me a bottle of Motrin or ibuprofen, and he'd say, how many of these can you tolerate in a day, before we had the advent, right, of biologics. And, we were fortunate enough to be alive for that innovation. But where it intersects with the question around, well, how does an issue become an issue? Medicare at the time was covering infused therapies, right? So if it was a Part B drug that was administered in a physician's office or in a hospital infusion center, there was coverage, for an infused biologic for arthritis. But there wasn't for a self-injectable product at the time, before there was a Medicare Part D as in dog. And, we just got a lot of, inquiries from folks around the country saying, hey, look, as an individual with arthritis, I'd like to have the option where my rheumatologist and I can decide what's the most appropriate care. And I don't understand why Medicare is so clunky and outdated that there's coverage for one of these because it's administered through an IV, and there's not coverage for another because it's in my refrigerator and I can inject it once a week. So, that groundswell of support, worked within the entire organization. And then as we were doing priority setting, we said, well, this is an important issue for the community, and we have to figure out a legislative response. And so we worked with a congresswoman from Washington State, a Republican named Jennifer Dunn. Those of you might remember, Immunex was a little company in Seattle that originally was the innovator around Amgen that was purchased by, the Enbrel, and that was purchased by Amgen. And we've seen a lot of innovation beyond that. There's a whole, series of drugs that treat that. But that then led us to create, introducing legislation that created a demo project under Medicare Part D that accelerated access for about 50,000 Medicare beneficiaries, for that. But, that was an amazing, an amazing sort of cycle of seeing how that came up from folks. And then we made it happen, and the foundation got that done. And I'll never forget the night that they got that bill passed. And it was a great achievement for the organization.
That's awesome. And I think, Deb, you mentioned accumulated adjustment programs, and I always remember the beginning days of that issue, just because, and for those that may not recall, accumulated adjustment programs are kind of a recent insurance barrier that restricts assistance, copay assistance from counting towards a patient's cost sharing. And I think people often think, okay, this issue goes from an issue to a legislative cycle. And I think one of the things on that issue that I'll say is that it was something that really became a problem because of rulemaking, and we tried to resolve it via rulemaking. And even after that, we tried to do education. We reached out to the insurance commissioners in states and said, hey, our patients aren't aware of these programs in their insurance contracts. Can you help us with disclosure, or help us make patients more aware of them? And that was before we even kind of started working on introduction of legislation. And so that kind of goes with kind of some of these issues. They may be things that can be solved without legislation, or we try to exhaust any other ways of resolution, whether that's maybe reaching out to individual payers that might be the bad actors and saying, hey, we're hearing some of these stories from our patients. Is this something that we can solve? Or else, we may have to start moving into, which is the next phase of our discussion, is introduction. But anything else that folks would want to say on kind of the issues and how we work on them, why we work on them, and how they kind of bubble up?
I'm going to actually speak to that really quick, but again, being part of it, you don't know it's a problem until it's a problem. So, and the best way that we, like for anybody that's listening out there right now, the Arthritis Foundation captures stories all the time. And that's how we find out there's problems. And then, our voices of telling our stories reaches somebody else and says, oh, I didn't know I could change that, or that was something we can fix. So again, that's for all of you guys out there. If you guys know if something's happening in your world and it just doesn't, like you're doing a gut check and it doesn't feel right, let the Arthritis Foundation know. Staff, we've got recording centers in the Action Center and things like that, that we can record those. And if we hear it more than once, we'll start to realize it might be a problem.
Absolutely. Don't assume that we may have heard of it, because, like you said, I think it's when we hear about it from multiple different sector patients, that's when we really kind of, okay, this is something that we need to dive into a little bit more. So yeah, reach out to us, reach out to our helpline. I think that's when bubbling up really helps us. Yeah. Kevin, anything else on your end on this on the issues?
No, I would reiterate and maybe add a little bit to Deb's comment. I think what's really important, sometimes Washington seems or your state capital, seems very distant and very, they speak a different language, they act in a different way. And, I couldn't possibly have any influence there. Don't be discouraged. It really, the best ideas come from problems, unfortunately, that, are happening to, real individuals. And, the only way you can affect change is to make sure people are hearing you. So don't be discouraged. Know that you're probably one of many people that are experiencing whatever that issue is. And the only way we're going to change it is if we know that it's happening and that we can build that, group of people and tell those stories and affect that change. So I just would encourage people to follow everything that Deb just said.
Absolutely. So now, as we move into the introduction, Kevin actually gave a kind of a great kind of description and story about kind of how kind of that issue has kind of morphs into kind of actual bill legislation, and we'll dive into that, I think, a little bit more in this section. But I think one of the things that you may often hear as an advocate is the term model language and kind of what that means. And I think as we work on these issues, I think a lot of these issues, we work on the development of model language around the issue. And you'll see that with step therapy, with the cumulative adjustment programs, and other issues that we often work on. And that's when we kind of develop a coalition, say, hey, this isn't something that specifically impacts arthritis patients, it impacts hemophilia patients, MS patients, all these other groups too. And then we'll get together and say, hey, what's the solution? What should we do? What are we striving for? Have we exhausted any other kind of regulatory means to solve this? And we'll kind of put down on paper, kind of build language that makes sense, that's going to solve this. And the benefit of model language is that it's kind of standard across states, across federal lines, so that you're not going to get a legislator that's saying, hey, is this some crazy idea that you're having me introduce here, or is this something that's feasible? And I think that's where you see kind of after a bill really gets over the hurdle in one or a few states, that's why it's so crucial, because then you'll see that, okay, this has been enacted in this state, and it really kind of latches on. And that's where kind of model language really kind of can be crucial. Of course, there's going to be situations where kind of a particular state or federal feds will say, well, we don't like this definition, or we don't like this wording or this path. So they're going to vary it a little bit, and that's kind of worked into the model. But you'll see that that's why a lot of these bills look pretty similar to each other, because we kind of want to be able to have that pointing, or we know if this works in one state, it can help solve the solution in another situation too. But other kind of topics in introduction, Kevin, I wanted to ask you kind of in your past, as far as when you get a bill introduced, kind of, can you give a little bit of behind the scenes as far as kind of how are the discussions with staff, departments, the administration possibly involved in drafting of that bill? Is that something that they're kind of leaning on you as the stakeholder that knows a lot about the subject, or is this something where those other parties are very much involved in?
Yeah, no, Stephen, I think you shaped that, you framed that very well. So, generally what will happen is, somebody approaches you, if you're staff, you're the healthcare staff or in an office, say, and they'll describe to you the challenge, talk about the solution. And, in some cases, they may actually give you either model legislation to look at or draft legislation, but they'll give you some sort of template, to work from. And that's very common. And then usually then what the staff will do with that is they'll probably, have a discussion internal to the office, talk to the boss, hey, is this idea worthy of our time? Where does it fit within the healthcare priorities, let's say, that we're working on? Is this something we can really, devote a lot of attention to, or is it something that maybe we should take a pass on because we just are overloaded with what we're trying to accomplish? And if the answer comes back, this is something that's important, you would largely want to find a member of the other party that would be your, original sort of co-sponsor, so that it's bipartisan, because that's going to increase the chances of success. You might have some folks that you offer, and say, hey, we think that these are the folks that you may want to work with. If that all happens, either concurrent or, maybe these don't happen all in the same sequence, but you'd probably then go to, the House and Senate both have sort of offices with really smart attorneys who will either look at that draft legislation and they may say, you might want to, the Social Security Act might go here in the Medicare statute, or, different things that they might want to do. I think most of the staff that you're interacting with are going to be non-lawyers. They may have a policy background and may understand that pretty well, but they may not, and I'm including myself in that group when I was a health LA. You really lean on these lawyers. I remember the first time I sat down I think it's in the first floor of Cannon House Office Building is where all these offices are. And I was sitting across from a guy who was a lawyer, had been there for like 20 years. And he's got the, all the federal code behind him. And I'm thinking about the federal healthcare part. And I'm like, he probably wrote most of it. So it was as a staff person, a sort of intimidating experience. Know that, I think the guy's name at the time was Ed Grossman. You're just like, oh my gosh, this guy was like a rock star. But then he would help you figure that out. And then you might share that with the group that came to you and say, hey, what do you guys think? And there's a whole, sort of process of fine tuning that. And then once everybody's comfortable, you move to, have your boss take and introduce the bill. And you go after what's called technical advice. You'd ask HHS, okay, what do you guys think of this? That can happen before the bill gets introduced or afterwards. Once that's done and they provided comment, then you go to the process of talking to the Congressional Budget Office folks, because they're going to want to know that, CMS or HHS have reviewed it. And if their review results in any material changes, which could affect how they're going to financially score the bill. So they generally want that process to happen first, because then they'll come back and say, okay, your bill is going to cost, $1 billion over 10 years. As much as we all want it to be dynamic and say, well, it's going to reduce healthcare costs in all these different areas, they just will say, this device that you want to cover costs $10. And we're going to assume that probably twice as many beneficiaries are going to have access to this than you think, just to be on the safe side. So, then you have the process of building the co-sponsors and trying to have a hearing and finding a legislative vehicle to attach it to, and, all those various pieces that fall from there.
No, I think you said it well. And I think a lot of it translates, and folks might be kind of seeing this as Kevin went through it. A lot of those processes are very similar on the state level as far as kind of introduction, kind of the same way, getting a fiscal note attached to the bill pretty early on, and sometimes those fiscal notes not looking at offsets. I think sometimes in things like step therapy, we're able to point out, well, we're putting in processes and guardrails to ensure that step therapy is still allowed, but not used in certain circumstances, or the bad situations that could lead to step therapy becoming a cost driver as opposed to a cost saver. But sometimes these kind of fiscal review kind of departments or committees are really only looking at kind of, well, this is going to lead to patients being on higher cost drugs, or like I said, the devices. So it's kind of maneuvering through that is kind of very well said. Deb, I'm going to go to you as far as kind of what's it like being in those kind of meetings in the early days with a bill, whether it's kind of just got a bill introduced and looking for co-sponsorship, or even in cases where we may not have kind of a bill, but kind of talking to them about, hey, there's this idea, and would you want to be our champion? Kind of, I know that those types of meetings can be very intimidating, even for kind of anyone, no matter how long you've been involved in this world.
Yeah, again, I've had lots and lots of visits with legislators. I've also had phone calls too. Some of those first asks you've got to have like the Senate bill in front of you so that the LA can write those things down and then they can do their homework on it. And, I've had really good experience in person as well as those video calls I've had with legislators. And it is, I think to be prepared and to do your homework, the Arthritis Foundation does a fabulous job kind of letting you know what the ask is, what's the true crux of the ask, and what you're asking, and what the benefits are, and giving some of those personal stories. They're really impactful, and the Arthritis Foundation makes you very prepared, but also know that you don't have to have every answer. You could say, I really don't know that answer. Let me write that down right now, and I will get an answer for you. And you'll probably get the person's card. And if you're on a video call, then you ask for the person's, just double check their email so you can get the answer back to them. And then you go back to the Arthritis Foundation staff and say, okay, guys, help. And they are more than willing and will come back with a robust information to send back to that legislator so you can get their questions asked and let them know that you are for real. And, again, you don't have to be perfect and you don't have to know everything, because you've got these other ways of being able to communicate with them again. And it also you become more memorable because, hey, they asked you a question and you followed back up. Hey, that's actually pretty novel for the Arthritis Foundation to be doing that. So some of those things, but it is nerve-wracking. Just remember, deep breath and, feel confident, but do your homework first and look through what all the asks are and all the material the foundation has provided for you before you go in. Don't go in cold. That would be my only, caveat, is just say, just don't do that. The Arthritis Foundation provides you with everything that you need to succeed. And
I think
empowered.
You definitely said it well, as far as kind of, there's unlikely that they're going to ask you a question that we may not as staff heard from another office.
Right.
And so don't be intimidated by it. Don't necessarily kind of try to have to answer it yourself. Just say, hey, we'll get back to you. And the importance of follow-up is so important. I think there's very few times where, especially on introduction, but even on co-sponsors, where it hasn't taken follow-up to actually get that kind of job done. There's maybe questions or things like that, or even just following up with the proper information to get that done on where to send everything through the process. So follow-up so important. I think that sometimes offices, they're so busy, they're going meeting to meeting to meeting all day long. So following up is so important, because some meetings they won't follow up with. So they're probably only gonna actually do the things for ones that they're kind of giving that kind of multiple touch bases on. So yeah. Perfect. Kevin, anything else that you'd want to say on kind of this introduction phase?
Yeah, I would just add to what Deb said, which I think was pretty perfect. Look, the foundation has had decades of experience in relationships here in Washington and has its outstanding reputation. As a representative of the foundation, you're a subject matter expert. Mm-hmm. I'm a professional registered lobbyist, or as I tell my children, I sell ideas. But I need to understand markups and TA and CBO scores. You don't need to know any of that. Okay. Your job is to talk about your journey, either living with arthritis or caring with somebody with arthritis or treating someone with arthritis, and then pulling that thread through to say, okay, we know now that access to a biologic is being, restricted due to X. we need you to co-sponsor this bill because it's going to fix that. And, yes, as Deb said, make sure you do your homework to understand that how your story connects to that legislative thread. But as far as understanding if there's going to be a markup on a bill or any of those sort of technical terms that we like to use in Washington that creates barriers for anybody to understand what's going on, that's nothing that you need to. I mean, you can certainly learn it if you like, but don't let those things scare you or intimidate you. Your job really there's say 50 meetings that staffer might be taking a week. It's to plant that really sticky story in that person's head so that your story stands out among all the other pieces of information that person's carrying. And then, as Deb said, following up.
No, I said that's well. Deb, I'm going to go back to you because I think as we've got now the bill introduced and we're now starting to look through co-sponsor and doing all those things, can now move into the kind of movement of the bill. And I think this is where I think some of our advocates can really make the most difference on a bill is when we're going to see in this life of the bill, kind of the hearing phase and things like that. So kind of what can our advocates do to really make the difference on bills here?
So again, social media is a pretty big one. I'm just going to touch on that quickly. Twitter, probably more heavily than Facebook or Instagram. Legislators tend to be connected by Twitter in particular. So tweeting, and again, the Arthritis Foundation, for certain asks, make it really easy. They pre-form them and you just have to put your information in. You can add a few points of your story to these tweets or emails or things like that, and off it goes. Takes less than 5 minutes to do that kind of impact. I've also been part of, I've shared my story for hearings for both biosimilars as well as for step therapy, and I've actually done my at hearings, the stories. And again, that's not something you have to really be concerned about because the Arthritis Foundation hooks you up with somebody that helps write that story for you if you would like that. And that was me. Yes, I will talk to you on a conversation and let you know all the pieces. And if you will write that for me, that is fantastic. So that was wonderful. With the all copays count and accumulators, my story was captured with that as well and shared at the last hearing. They only allowed 3 people at the hearing and they had people chosen. So I was number 4, but again, my story was shared with the person collecting the stories. So again, none of it is hard, and it's actually very empowering. I've sat at tables. I've been in the Capitol where, you're sitting there and you walk up to the table and you're telling your story. And it's empowering because that something that's happened to you, you're trying to share your story to help prevent that from happening to somebody else and helping fix the problem.
Definitely. I think people think hearing it and they get intimidated, but your own story as a patient. I've never really seen kind of a legislator go after an advocate for their own story. So that's kind of in a hearing or in these legislative meetings that you as advocates are preparing to do, is that it's your journey, it's your story, and so they're going to listen, they're going to be taking note of what you're saying. So don't be intimidated about sharing your story. I love what you said about social media. I often think kind of just sharing your story in general is a great way here because it's going to help in social media. It's going to help in these hearing rooms, in legislative meetings, but press. I think similarly, hearings, if you have a story that's really relevant and we're working on this issue, it's going to help we often work with PR firms or different stakeholders that can look for, and not whether it's an op-ed or a story about the bill. So I think just in general, sharing your story is just so important. Kevin, I'm going to go to you. Just in your experience in this process of kind of the movement of the bill, what are going to be some hurdles or barriers that are put in place that could potentially slow a bill down? I know that's probably especially relevant on a federal level, as I think we often feel like, as my relationship to the states, we can get a bill passed in a year that kind of just gets introduced for the first time. But sometimes there's going to be, on a federal level, multiple sessions where you're going to have to introduce the idea, get buy-in, and everything like that. So especially on the federal level, what are some barriers that you see that kind of slow down the process?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll give you one good example. So a client that I'm working with, we just got legislation introduced on expanding Medicare coverage for digital prescription therapeutics. And the bill number in the House that we were assigned was 7,051, which means that there were 7,050 bills introduced before our bill. And we're midway, a quarter of the way into the second session of the 117th Congress. So there could be 10,000 pieces of legislation that get introduced this session of Congress alone. So not all of those bills are going to become law. So one of them is just the sheer sort of competition of ideas and priority setting and inability to do everything would be one reason. I think number two is costs. Members on both sides of the aisle are always conscious of what a bill is going to cost. And, sometimes you might get somebody that says to you, well, do you have an offset for that? And, we used to run into this with Congressman Dave Obey at the time, who was chairman of the House Appropriations Committee. And we'd ask him about, increasing funding for arthritis research at NIH. And he'd say, well, you're going to cut what part of the Bush tax cuts are you going to get rid of? And I had some advocates that were white, as sheets when they'd walk out of that office, because he was pretty rough about it, and we'd say, well, we don't comment on tax issues. We're not a tax organization. And he said, well, how else do you expect that I'm going to fund this? And it was always a challenging conversation because we said, look, we're advocating for people with arthritis. We're not in the business of cutting somebody else's funding. You're going to cut diabetes funding. You're going to cut, funding for autism research. I mean, it can be a little tricky. And again, I think you have to hold your ground in a polite way and just say, look, I'm speaking on behalf of a patient community that cares about this. And I'm not, the foundation hasn't taken a position on the position you're trying to steer me into. The other issue I always say to folks is, I always imagine when I'm going to talk on an issue that, my opposition is going to come in right after us. And so anytime that there's not sort of a unanimity in a position, or if there's somebody that has a different viewpoint, the Hill has a tendency to not want to get, involved in controversy or be seen as having to referee between two interests. So it can be hard when, the insurance companies are saying one thing and the pharmaceutical groups and the patient groups are saying something else. And you have to, again, this isn't really so much for the advocates, but it is for the organizations to think through how do you handle that, because they may not mention that in the meeting, but it's in their minds. So those are a couple of issues that are just, sort of the competition of ideas, trying to find alliances and, as broad a group of stakeholders you can, recognizing that, there is a story to be told about, yes, it may seem that something costs something. The CBO may not want to do that, but I think as humans, we can understand that if you're reducing, physician visits on one side, or if you're reducing, the need for a joint replacement or something along those lines, there are real savings to be had. And I think some people do get that story.
No, and I think that's right, and I think very similar on the states, that on the federal level, there's deadlines that have to be met on the state level, and for those that are listening, you probably know that the kind of state level sessions move quickly. I think there are some states that are already done, and we're only in mid-March. There's quite a number that are ending this month and next month, especially in these even years as they prepare for election season, and they're often dealing with a number of different things like budgets and really focused a cost mind. So kind of thinking through the deadline process, whether it's kind of getting out that first committee, getting out of the fiscal or appropriations committee, getting out of the first chamber, the second chamber, all of those usually on a state level have specific set sometimes constitutional deadlines that you have to get through, and sometimes those may not fit with kind of the discussion that's at hand, or the kind of the general discussion that's taking place around the Capitol with other issues, or with the finances at that time, or the discussion that I think Kevin brought up as far as with the stakeholders that may be opposing the bill. Those are stakeholder meetings that we often have. We try to get them done as quickly as possible. Sometimes those discussions don't take place until there's an actual bill. Sometimes that's strategic, that they'll want to see an actual bill introduced. But then if a session's only a couple of months left and you have to do those negotiations, you may not meet the deadlines that you need to. And so that's some of the reasons why you may see some of these bills take multiple sessions to come back, is you're dealing with some of those types of barriers or things that are not necessarily dealing with the particular bill at hand, but it's part of the process of chipping away. Anything else that either of you want to say as far as kind of this meat of the bill's life, as far as the movement process?
I don't think so. Not here.
Perfect. Now we're in this hypothetical. We've gone through all those hurdles. We've jumped through them all, and we're heading to the governor's desk or the president's desk, and hoping that he or she may sign our bill into law. This one for kind of either of you, Kevin or Deb. Kind of, have either of you been in a situation where you've been a part of a bill effort and it's going through that process of you pass both chambers, you're on the way? What's that like? I've been there, and I know there's anxiety with it. What's it like to be a part of it? Have you kind of seen it get over the edge, and what's that in between period like, as far as knowing that, okay, what are they going to sign it or not? And what's it like when they actually have kind of pulled the trigger and signed it?
I've actually been to 2 of the bill signings from the governors. I've been part of the step therapy as well as the biosimilars, and it was, I mean, exciting, because knowing that your story helped make that difference, and testifying, that was actually a big part of it. I think it was exciting, but still, I think you have a good idea if the governor is going to sign it or not. At least both times I have been told that there's a pretty good chance. And I've got 2 pens to show it, and they're sitting in a drawer somewhere, so nobody uses them. Except one day I left them out on the counter, and there's my son just scribbling away. I'm like, bud, that's important to me. How about you, Kevin?
I mean, on the federal side, it's a little bit anticlimactic. Once you get into a legislative vehicle, because unfortunately, I think over the last at least 2 decades, we've kind of evolved from, individual bills being passed and then, getting conferenced with the other body and then moving on to the White House for signature, where you just have these really, really big packages. So if you can get in that package, by the time that's all said and done, generally that's going to go to the White House, and, maybe there's a veto because of some bigger issue. But usually you're just, whether it's the funding bill that I know just passed that's got a few arthritis important items in, it's usually done by then. I mean, I think, in states maybe where I think some states still have a line item veto where I guess the governor could take something out and still sign the bill. That might be, a little more of a white knuckle experience. But on the federal side, in general, it's the hard part is getting it, included in that final vehicle that's going to go to the president's desk.
Yeah, I think on a state level, a lot of the bills our advocates will see are what are called single subject bills. It's just going to be, yeah. So then where it's just a step therapy bill, it's just an accumulator bill. But I think the thing that you'll see for our advocates to know is that usually throughout this process, we're talking with the departments, and getting their feedback, listening to them, incorporating those into the bills. And usually the departments, whether it's in a lot of cases, those are kind of governor appointees that are running them in a lot of cases, or there's some interaction between the governor's office and the departments to provide that feedback. So you'll have that gauge right there as far as knowing, okay, we've been working with them. In some cases, it might be a governor or lieutenant governor endorsed bill, but in some cases along the process, you'll often hear that feedback from the governor's office through the department, and knowing, okay, we may be struggling, or if you've gotten that far, they've had that ability to provide feedback. Sometimes kind of outwardly, a lot of governors don't publicly comment on pending legislation, but I think behind the scenes, they still probably won't be commenting or guarantee a signature to some of the stakeholders, but they'll have that opportunity throughout the process to be able to weigh in or say, hey, fix this, and we'll feel better. And so there's that ability to know going in. But there's been a lot of cases where it's like, oh, I do not know where this is going, but then there's been a lot of cases where we know, okay, we're like Deb said, we're scheduling bill signings, and so have that opportunity to feel good about it. As we're closing out here, I want to say that the signature, the issue's not over then. I think some people forget that, hey, there's an implementation process. There's a check to make sure that this bill is working right. And I think what we often do is stress the importance of education to folks like yourself as advocates, to ensure that, hey, we passed this great bill. Here's what it does. If you're still experiencing this, here's who to contact. And we've done that for a lot of our state bills. We've done it for some of our kind of federal successes. I think the one that comes to mind is the No Surprises Act, dealing with surprise billing and providing a lot of kind of, hey, here's what to do if you're still going through the process. But there's also one thing that I'll mention before I kick it to you, Deb and Kevin, is that sometimes these bills will go through rulemaking. So the departments will not only weigh in throughout the process, but they'll also get a chance to kind of play with the bill or kind of build on it through a rulemaking process that we are definitely usually involved with in writing comments to or providing feedback to along the way to make sure that bills are implemented correctly or not kind of spun away from their intent in that process. So it is definitely something that we want to stress as an important piece of the life cycle of the bill, is that it's not necessarily over when there's a signature. Deb and Kevin, anything that you'd say about kind of the implementation process, or anything that you've seen in your experiences with this kind of later stage of the bill or now law cycle?
One thing that did happen with step therapy, so here after the state bill was signed, a year later, one of the networks reached out to me and wanted to do a TV piece on, it's a year later now, how are things going? And that went really well. I reached out to you guys in a hurry because literally they gave me, we'll be there in an hour, and came to the house, and I was like, okay, in the meantime, I'm calling AF and whoever I can get on the phone and say, all right, what points should I get across? And it turned out to be a great piece, like a really quick segment on the news, but it was, checking bases a year later. It was kind of a cool process to be part of too.
Yeah, I would just add, it's sort of like, when you're running a race, you got to make sure you run through the tape. And so, everybody'd say, hey, the race is over, the bill's been signed into law. But I mean, you're probably more than halfway through the process, but there is an important implementation phase. And, again, I think you lean on the experts at the Arthritis Foundation, like Stephen and his colleagues, to guide advocates on how to do that. But generally speaking, on the federal level, the agency is going to take that and they're going to provide an interpretation, and they'll come out with, a proposed rule or guidance or something that's going to govern how, agencies implement the law, in question. And so usually there's a public comment period, and, that's going to be an opportunity for advocates to comment, on what's happening. And I think one really important lesson for folks to understand is that process is so important, and it's really important that those not be, the agencies will flag every time a response looks the same. So yes, having a standard reply and making sure that the request is the same, but if it's, I am my hometown, this, and this, the agency actually scoops all of those up and says that was one response. So you could send 1,000 of those sort of form letters, but you have to be real careful to make sure that you really are truly sharing your story with the same, request at the end, because otherwise there'll just be 1,000 stories that they count as one. It also sort of reminds me a little bit of like when people would show up back in the day, and I was on the Hill, and they'd have a petition maybe that was signed in front of a grocery store. And it didn't really have as much because you're like, I don't know, somebody's in a hurry and they're walking out with their kids and they've got 10 bags of groceries and somebody gets them to sign something. They may not have any idea what they just signed. So just making sure you're authentic, but tracking that process through to the end to make sure that that law that you worked so hard to get passed gets implemented in a way that actually truly benefits, people with arthritis who need, whatever it is that we're trying to accomplish. So just run through the tape.
No, the analogy I often hear is a very similar one is the sports one I often heard growing up was run through the line, not to the line. And I think it's the same thing as far as kind of don't run to the signature or run to the implementation, because there's been, it's an important piece of the puzzle. So now kind of we've gone through that process. I think as we close here, I just want to thank you as our advocate who's viewing this for taking the time to listen to this. Hopefully there's some value that you got out of it, and it provided some context and about how you can participate in the process, but then what are some of the things that we as staff are doing or stakeholders are doing, or some of the things that are behind the scenes. And so we hope you enjoy this. I'll kick it over to Deb and then Kevin for any kind of closing comments that you'd want to make to our viewer.
The one thing is just, get out there. You don't know until you're part of it. And it's something that isn't as hard as it may feel. The Arthritis Foundation, makes you so prepared. They've created so many documents and so many different learning tools that you actually take with you, leave behind messaging, that's all that professional language that's done for you, and you just leave it behind, but we're sharing our stories in the meantime. Social medias, don't underestimate it. Get involved, go to the Action Center, share those emails, share the Twitter posts. It's just the Arthritis Foundation makes it so easy, and your story is valuable, so don't underestimate that.
Yeah, I would just add to what Deb says. I mean, I'm always reminded of a story of a young advocate when I was with the foundation, Kaylee Kunkel, who I just am so proud of, the opportunity I've had to work with her and get to know her. And, she walked into Senator Kit Bond from Missouri's office, didn't really know what was going on, was a young kid telling her story. And then years later, when she got married up in West Point, Kit Bond's healthcare staffer went to the wedding. I mean, that was the kind of, and I'm not saying everybody's going to have a relationship with their member of Congress that, they get invited to the wedding, but it shows you the power of that story and the connection that you can make to an office if you give it, your best effort, and you find that there's, a shared interest in an office. But it's, it's all a matter of, what you want to make of it. And I just think it's a tremendously rewarding opportunity. Don't let the acronyms or, the way that these processes are described, throw you off. If you were to, sit down with a lawyer or a doctor or, anybody who's involved in any sort of work, there's a language, there's a culture to it. The Hill's no different. So just don't let those things throw you off. Have fun, tell your story. Understand that you're, part of a really important and strong community and movement, and that there's strength in our stories and in our numbers and our passions. So I hope everybody, has a wonderful time and goes out and just, helps change the world.
Well said, both of you. And I want to thank both of you. And I think we're going to wrap up here with just some breaking news that we want to share with you. And it's kind of the perfect session to kind of talk about this because We just got word right before going live with this, and Kevin mentioned it a little bit earlier, is that the Pediatric Subspecialty Loan Repayment Program that was authorized in 2010, and that we've been working year over year, and many of you have taken time in these meetings to talk about this issue of ensuring that we have more pediatric rheumatologists in loan repayment for those folks going into pediatric rheumatology is one way to encourage that. Was funded, not just authorized, but funded. And we just got word before going on to this that it was funded for $5 million. So we're hoping that will lead to many more folks going into pediatric rheumatology, practicing in underserved areas that really need it, and that's super exciting. And I think that just does a great job of showing that, hey, you have something that's authorized, takes 12 years to get funded, but not to give up, and it's going to lead to something great like this, and just the life cycle that some of these things can take on, whether through legislation or appropriations or rulemaking, is that we'll be here along the way every step to make sure that we have better care and access for patients. So thank you both, Deb, Kevin, for jumping on, and I'll echo that. I hope everyone has great meetings and a great Platinum Ambassador Assembly. Thank you.